This is a lecture for Global Business Economics on price adjustment. The Keynesian story, as embodied in the aggregate expenditure model, tells us why real GDP differs from potential output, but as pointed out in the video on the aggregate expenditure model, it doesn't tell us why the economy eventually recovers. To understand that, we need to look at price adjustment in the economy. More exactly, we need to understand two different things. We need to understand why, when actual output is different from potential output, we're going to get a change in prices. We also need to understand why those changes in prices will lead to changes in GDP. The first question is the easier one of the two, and it's also really the more important one, because it's the first question that will tell us about what we expect inflation to be in the short run, based on the aggregate expenditure model. The second question, why these changes in prices actually lead to adjustment in GDP, bringing the economy back to long-run equilibrium, that's really more of a technical footnote to the aggregate expenditure model, but I do want to go through it just for completeness sake. So this is the picture for price adjustment. It shows us that in the long run, we expect the economy to be at the level of potential output, and we expect inflation to be at its autonomous level. That autonomous level of inflation is the long-run anchor, pinned down primarily by the actions of the central bank. So, for example, in Australia, where the Reserve Bank targets an inflation rate of 2 to 3% on average, that is going to be pinning down the autonomous inflation rate, the long-run inflation rate in the economy. It's also essentially pinning down expected inflation, and in many circumstances we can think about autonomous inflation as being just the same thing as expected inflation. Okay, so we now understand why expected inflation is going to be linked to actual inflation. What about the other piece of price adjustment, the link between the state of the economy and the prices that firms set? Well, when the economy is in a recession, firms are going to expect there to be smaller increases in marginal cost looking ahead, because in a recession they're not going to expect so much cost pressure on labor and other inputs. The labor market is soft, you're not going to see big increases in wages and so forth. Firms will therefore increase prices by less than expected inflation. The opposite happens in a boom. Firms are going to anticipate larger increases in marginal cost, and therefore they're going to be likely to increase prices by more than expected inflation. So that, again, just to remind you, gives us these two pieces of price adjustment: the long run, where the economy is at potential output and inflation is at its autonomous or expected level, and then deviations of inflation from this autonomous level when the economy deviates from potential output. So the next piece is to understand how these adjustments of prices cause the economy to go back to its long-run equilibrium level of GDP. So there the point is that changes in prices will lead to changes in planned spending, because changes in prices will lead to changes in autonomous spending. So again, as a reminder, the aggregate expenditure model is based on a given value of the price level. If we have increases in the price level, then that's going to tend to decrease autonomous spending. If we have decreases in the price level, that will tend to increase autonomous spending. There are actually several different ways in which changes in the price level affect spending. We should be a little bit more precise about this. Really, we're talking about changes in price relative to expectations. So the planned spending line in the aggregate expenditure model is real planned spending. You can think about all the variables in the aggregate expenditure model as being real variables: real consumption, real GDP, and so forth. So if we have constant predictable inflation, if the inflation rate is at its long-run autonomous level, then the planned expenditure line is not going to shift. So in the long-run equilibrium of the economy, when we have autonomous inflation and GDP is at potential, the planned expenditure line is not going to shift. All right, so I'm going to trace through three ways in which deviations of inflation from autonomous inflation can lead to changes in output. So first, suppose inflation between last month and this month was lower than expected. Well, this means if we think about households who are savers in the economy, then they're going to have earned a higher real interest rate than they expected at the time they made their savings decisions, at the time they wrote any contracts. Because the real interest rate is from the Fisher equation, the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So lower inflation is going to tend to lead to a higher real return on savings. Households will be unexpectedly richer and they'll increase their consumption, shifting up planned spending. We call this the wealth effect. So that's one way that prices being lower than expected, or more precisely inflation being lower than expected, will lead to higher planned spending. The second reason that inflation affects the level of GDP is because people hold cash for transactions purposes. When inflation is lower than expected, people are going to need less money, less cash. This means they're going to tend to exchange money for interest-bearing assets instead. And this means that they are buying assets and therefore they are lending. This is increasing the supply of credit in the economy. An increase in the supply of credit will tend to push down real interest rates. That will encourage investment spending and it will encourage consumption spending. So we have a mechanism that says people will tend to want to hold more interest-bearing assets, and therefore that will push down interest rates, encouraging spending in the economy. The third mechanism also works through interest rates in the credit market, but it's slightly different. It works through the behavior of the central bank. When inflation is lower than expected, then the central bank may decide to lower interest rates. Very often central banks follow rules whereby the interest rates that they set are linked to the inflation rate in the economy. So in this case, the central bank will exchange money for interest-bearing assets and increase the supply of credit in the economy. Again, that will push down real interest rates, encourage investment, and encourage consumption. So this is the mechanism where if we're in a recession, we will see reductions in inflation relative to expected, pushing up autonomous spending, pushing up planned spending, and therefore increasing real GDP. So when the economy is in recession, we're going to tend to see inflation being lower than expected, and then that is going to set in motion these mechanisms that will tend to increase planned spending and eventually move us back to the long-run equilibrium where the economy is back at potential output.